Hey guys, my name is Nokomis, and this is Thursday, so I thought I'd give you a 3-minute Thursday specifically about a topic that comes up around Christian circles when it comes to the subject of a man named Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh comes up not just because of the crazy stuff that happened in Exodus, but because of a crazy verse that happens in Romans chapter 9. In fact, a whole section in the chapter 9 of Romans where God essentially says, I hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now, God is sovereign and he can do whatever he wants, but it brings up a really big question of, does God create people in order to harden their hearts? And the reason that's an important question is because it really has to do a lot with the character of God and who God is. And so what I want to talk about is what actually happened with Pharaoh whenever God says, I hardened his heart. So in order to find the answer, we have to jump all the way back to Pharaoh's original story in the book of Exodus when it comes to Moses and the 10 plagues. All right, so we're going to go through these plagues really fast, and I hope you can keep up. So first plague is turning the river into blood. Moses takes his staff, hits the river with it, and the entire river turns to blood, and Pharaoh's mind is blown. But it says this about his heart in chapter 7, verse 22 of Exodus. Pharaoh's heart is hardened. Now the question is, who hardened Pharaoh's heart? It doesn't really say. It just says Pharaoh's heart was hardened, which would mean it was hardened by someone. Now the question is, was it hardened by God or was it hardened by Pharaoh himself? Did he harden his heart? We really don't quite know yet. And so we get to plague number 2. Plague number 2 was an infestation of frogs, where Moses said, you know what, if you're not going to let the Hebrew slaves go, I'm going to cause frogs to come all over Egypt. And so all these frogs came. Pharaoh got mad, but would Pharaoh let the slaves go? No, because it says that he hardened his heart and would not listen. Who hardened Pharaoh's heart? Specifically with this second plague, it says that he hardened his heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not listen. Plague number 3. This one is a disgusting one. A whole bunch of gnats and flies. I hate gnats. They're swarming everywhere, and Pharaoh hated the gnats too. Moses brought the gnats. Pharaoh hated the gnats. And then Moses said, well, let our people go. But then it says in chapter 8, verse 19, that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, just like it did the first time. Now the question again is, who hardened Pharaoh's heart? We don't know. It doesn't say, but it does say that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Plague number 4 comes, and this time it's an infestation of flies. I don't know if it was the gnats, they turned into flies, they grew up and they became an even bigger plague. But anyway, these flies came. Again, Moses said, you know what, here's flies, let us go, where these flies are gonna take you out. And so Pharaoh was upset and mad, but still he would not let the people go. In chapter 8, verse 32 of Exodus, it says, Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also. So it's indicating that Pharaoh has been hardening his heart. And in this instance, when it comes to plague number 4 with the flies, Pharaoh is the one who hardens his heart. So the Hebrews, they're still in Egypt. They're not being let go. So Moses does a 5th miracle. And this time the miracle is a sad one, especially if you like cows. All the livestock dies. And all the livestock in Egypt dies. Pharaoh's upset about it. And then in chapter 9, verse 7, it says, the heart of Pharaoh was hardened. And again, it seems like we're not exactly sure who hardened Pharaoh's heart. It just says his heart was hardened, but it doesn't say by who. Was it by God or by Pharaoh? All right, so a recap over the first half of the plagues. We have 5 miracles happening. Pharaoh's heart hardened 5 times. 2 of those times for sure, it was Pharaoh hardening his heart. The other 3 times, we're not exactly sure who hardened his heart. Now, this is where things begin to change around. Because the Egyptians are still in Egypt, Moses still wants them to go, and we have 5 more miracles to get through, 5 more plagues. The 6th one of those is boils, where they begin to get these boils all over them. All the men, all the women, all the animals even have boils over them. And this time it said that when Pharaoh saw this, it wasn't he who hardened his heart, but this time it does say the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. So this is where God actually comes into play and he begins to harden his heart. It's not actually until verse 6 that we find out for sure that God is the one who hardens heart. But we still have the question of the other 3 times in the first 5 plagues of who hardened it. Was it God or was it Pharaoh? So the 6th plague didn't work of boils, and so this time Moses says, you know what, if you don't let my people go, I'm going to bring ice rocks from the sky and hail. And I actually don't know if it's ever hailed in Egypt before. It seems like a hot place. I'm not sure that they were used to that. But anyway, it begins to hail, and this time we get something really interesting about how Pharaoh's heart was hardened, because he said, you know what, that miracle's not going to work either. I'm still not going to let your people go. And it says this in chapter 9, verses 34 and 35. It says that Pharaoh sinned yet again. He hardened his heart, and his servants hardened their heart. And then it sums it up with this by saying, so the heart of Pharaoh was hardened. It uses the same terminology as those 3 times in the first 5 plagues of saying Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Now in those first 3, we weren't sure who was hardening the heart. Was it Pharaoh hardening the heart, or was it God hardening the heart? Now it uses the exact same terminology, but it clarifies that it was Pharaoh who sinned and hardened his own heart. Thus, Pharaoh's heart was hardened again. It's more likely than not that in those first three where we weren't sure who was hardening a heart, it was actually Pharaoh who was hardening his heart because of the language that we find in the seventh plague. So just a recap of the first 7 plagues now. For the first 5, we have Pharaoh hardening his heart. Probably he's the one in all those instances that hardened his own heart. And then in the 6th one, we have God stepping in and basically saying, if you're going to harden your heart in the 6th time, I'm going to harden your heart and make some punishment come. But the 7th time, God actually leaves it up to Pharaoh again, his own decision, his own, is he going to harden his heart or is he not going to? And Pharaoh actually chooses once again, when left up to his own choices, to harden his heart. And so now we have 3 more plagues. And the interesting thing about these last 3 plagues is in every single one of them, the 8th one was locust, the 9th one was darkness, and the 10th one there was this threatening that if you don't let my people go, the firstborn sons in all of Egypt are going to die. The interesting thing about this is in every single one of those times, it says that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. So the last 3 times, the last 3 plagues, it is actually the Lord who's hardening his heart. So when we read in Romans chapter 9 that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, does God actually harden people's heart to the point where they don't get a choice to make that decision anymore? If we're looking at the story of Pharaoh, which he's referencing in Romans chapter 9, the answer is yes. But if you look deeper into the story, it actually comes after a period of Pharaoh being able to choose whether his heart was hardened or not. So I think the thing that we can take from this is, yes, we do have a choice. Yes, we do have the ability to harden our own heart. We can believe in God or not. But after a long time of choosing not to believe, there are some instances, like in Pharaoh's life, where God says, you know what? I'm going to use your hard heart for my glory. Recently, I've been reading Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, and he actually talks about Moses and hardened hearts. And one of the things I want to leave you with is that the author of Hebrews makes it known that you have the ability to choose whether or not your heart is hardened. In Hebrews chapter 3, verse 8, he says this, "Today, if you hear the voice of God, do not harden your heart." And so essentially, one of the things that we can know is that whenever we're listening to God, when we hear God, or in Pharaoh's case, he saw those miracles that he knew was the power of God, we have an ability to listen and decide what we do with that. And the advice of the New Testament, the advice of Romans, the advice, an example given in the book of Exodus is when you hear the voice of God, don't harden your heart, open it up, and believe in him.